The Meanest Doll in the World by Anne Martin and Laura Goodwin. Chapter 10. Order. The dolls hid in the Lego hut for 2 hours. They huddled in the middle as far from the door as possible, even though Annabelle pointed out that lizards probably don't know how to open doors. Finally, Melody said, "You know, we're going to have to go out there and find Carl. Carl is a lizard," she told Annabelle and Tiffany. "We have to clean up this mess, too. We can't leave BJ's room looking like this." The other dolls nodded. "What are we going to do with Carl when we find him?" asked Tiffany. "Get him back in his cage somehow," said Melody. Annabelle was barely listening to this conversation. A very worrisome thought had occurred to her. Finally, she asked, "Does BJ's room get this messy every weekend?" "Usually," replied Penny. "Sometimes even messier." "Messier," whispered the cutouts. "Do you always manage to put everything back in order before BJ's family comes home?" "We try. BJ's room is so messy that it's a little hard to tell," said Yvonne. "We figure he won't notice if a few things aren't just as he left them." "Has there ever been anything big that you couldn't fix?" asked Annabelle. "I mean, did you ever have to leave a Lego building broken or Carl loose or something heavy knocked over?" Melody stared at Annabelle. "Why? What are you trying to say?" "Well, I'm just looking around at this mess." Annabelle pointed out the window of the Lego hut and thinking how hard it will be to clean up. And I'm wondering what will happen if we can't catch Carl. I know we can't fix the rip in that poster or the nick in the bed, and I'm guessing this happens almost every weekend, that there's some little something still broken or torn or out of place when BJ comes home. Annabelle paused and drew in a breath. "Don't you think maybe BJ's family is starting to get suspicious?" she said finally. Before anybody spoke, Annabelle had her answer. The faces of the other dolls told her everything, and Annabelle felt something inside of her grow very heavy. After a moment, Waterfall sighed and said, "We do think they're getting suspicious." "And what," went on Annabelle, wishing she didn't have to say this, "do you think that is going to mean for other dolls in other human houses?" "We don't know," said Melody. "We can barely stand to think about it. We just clean up here as well as we can, and we hope for the best." "Mean Mimi," said Annabelle slowly, "is a menace to all doll kind." Nobody disagreed with her. The dolls sat silently in the hut until from somewhere in BJ's house they heard a clock chime. 4:30, said Beth, sounding concerned. "We can't wait any longer. We have to start cleaning up. This is probably going to take all night." "We'll look for Carl while we work," said Waterfall. "Has he ever escaped before?" asked Tiffany. "Nope, this is the first time." "Have you ever even touched Carl?" asked Annabelle. "No, and I'd rather not think about that. We don't have a choice. We have to try to put Carl back in his cage if we find him. So let's get started." "How can you stand this?" asked Tiffany. "Me Mimi causes trouble for you every weekend, and then you have to clean up for her messes." "Like I said," Waterfall replied, "we don't have a choice." Annabelle, Tiffany, the cutouts, the PJ Party Pals, and the Troll Twins left the safety of the hut and peered cautiously around BJ's room. There was no sign of Carl. "All right, let's get started," said Yvonne. "We don't know where things go," Tiffany pointed out, "so you'll have to tell Annabelle and me what to do." The dolls worked side by side for hours. No one spoke except to say, The cars all have to go back to Kelly's room, or help me take this barricade apart, or just leave those things there. I think they were already on the floor. And every now and then, someone would scream, "There he is! There's Carl!" And then realize it was one of BJ's plastic lizards. It was early Sunday morning. The sun was streaming through BJ's window and brightening his room when Tiffany caught sight of Carl. "There he is! There's Carl!" she cried. "This time I really do see him." Tiffany pointed to the windowsill above Carl's cage, and sure enough, the lizard was basking in the warm sunlight. Annabelle was both terrified and relieved to see him. She didn't know where he had been all night, but it really didn't matter. "All right, everybody," she said, "we have to get him back in his cage. How are we going to do it?" Nobody wanted to touch Carl, and nobody wanted to hurt him. "Do you think," said Annabelle after a moment, "that if the cutouts tickle Carl, it might scare him and he would fall down into his cage?" "It's worth a try," said Penny. "Oh, yes, it's worth the try," sang the cutouts, and they began to make their way up the curtain that hung at the window. Annabelle noticed that they wisely climbed up the left-hand side, which was near the tip of Carl's tail, as far as possible from his eyes. She watched those eyes very closely and decided that maybe Carl was napping. She hoped so, because without warning, the cutout at the bottom of the chain suddenly let go of the curtain and swung away from it, sweeping along Carl's tail with her free hand. Carl wriggled. Then, startled, he jumped. "Pull me back!" squealed the cutout, but it wasn't necessary. In his confusion, Carl lost his balance and tumbled off the windowsill and into his cage below. "Good work!" cried Melody. And all the dolls rushed to the cage to look in at Carl. He seemed to be unhurt and resumed his nap. "All right, now we have to put the top back on the tank," said Yvonne. The other dolls groaned. The tank was much taller than any of them, and the lid was too heavy for them to lift easily. "You know what?" said Waterfall. "I just don't think I can do a single other thing. This is just too much." Melody glared at her, then said, "Okay, but this has to get done. If you don't want to help us, go sit in the hut. Anyone want to join her?" she asked the others. The dolls shook their heads, and Annabelle cringed, but she understood why Melody had spoken sharply. "This is getting desperate," she whispered to Tiffany. "What time is it?" "I don't know. Mid-morning, I guess. Look at this room." Annabelle nodded. It was still a mess. Carl had been caught, thank goodness, but hoisting the top back onto the tank was probably going to take hours, and the racetrack still had to be taken apart and put away. Waterfall was slinking off to the Lego hut when Annabelle heard a noise behind her, and she turned to see the Sandra doll lope into the room, holding her blanket in one hand and leading sleeping Billy along with the other. She stood in the mess, looking hopefully at the smaller dolls. "Sandra," said Melody. The Sandra doll offered a smile. "Did Mimi send you in here?" She shook her head. "Can we help you with something?" The Sandra doll gazed around at the messy room, and then she looked back at Melody. "I'm not sure I understand," said Melody. "I think I do," Annabelle said. "Sandra wants to help us clean up. Don't you, Sandra?" The Sandra doll smiled again. Then she let go of Sleeping Billy's hand and picked up a book that had been knocked from the shelf. She set it in place. "Ooh," said the PJ Party Pals. Melody brightened. "Could you put the top back on Carl's tank?" she asked. The Sandra doll crossed the room to the tank and replaced the top. "Thanks, thanks, our undying thanks," said the cutouts. "Yes, thank you," said the other dolls. Tiffany looked at Sleeping Billy. "What about him?" she asked. Will he help too? When the Sandra doll had let go of his hand, Sleeping Billy had slid onto his side and had fallen asleep. Now she straightened him up and showed him how to take apart the racetrack. This is great, exclaimed Beth. We'll have everything cleaned up in no time. Melody called Waterfall out of the Lego hut and apologized to her. Then the dolls set to work, and just as Beth had predicted, the room was cleaned up quickly. I think this is the best it's ever looked on a Sunday, said Yvonne. It's almost exactly as BJ left it. Except for the rip and the nick and a few other things, thought Annabelle. But she said nothing. Where are all of you supposed to be? Tiffany asked the dolls. In Callie's room? Yes, replied Penny. We'll go over there this afternoon. And we'll climb into BJ's backpack, said Annabelle. Does he take it to school every day? Just about, said Beth. Good, Annabelle replied. Then we'll be back in our house tomorrow. Home, sweet home. Home, sweet home, a mocking voice repeated from the doorway. Annabelle jumped when she heard Mean Mimi and stumbled backwards. Tiffany caught her, steadied her, and marched boldly across the room until she was standing just inches away from Mimi. No one's afraid of you anymore, you know, said Tiffany. She is, Mean Mimi replied, pointing at Annabelle. But she'll be gone tomorrow. You have no power here. I do too, cried Mimi. I have, You have nothing, said Tiffany. Everyone knows about Technoman now, and Miss Sandra doll and Sleeping Billy would rather be friends than fight. You, you can't do this to the queen of all dolls. But we did do it. For a few seconds, Tiffany and Mean Mimi stood facing one another. Mimi glared her fiercest glare, but Tiffany never looked away from her. At last, Mimi turned and stomped down the hall. Then Waterfall said what the other dolls were truly thinking. She may not have any control over us, but we don't have any control over her either. She's reckless. She'll do anything to get what she wants. She is still a menace to all doll kind. To all doll kind, whispered the cutouts as they slipped out of BJ's room and disappeared into the hall. A menace to all